So now it is my pleasure to ask on the stage Paoletta of Neste and Michael Gill, Executive Director of the Air Transport Action Group.
You go here. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this deep dive into the topic of sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF. It's a really timely moment to be discussing this topic, a really opportune moment to be discussing this really significant strategic topic, and I hope at the end of these 20 minutes or so that you spend with us, you'll understand why it's so strategically important. Why the timing of this session? Well, as we heard from Alexandre Gignac this morning, we're 10 years on from the moment when the entire industry, airlines, airports, ANSPs, and most of the major manufacturers came together under the umbrella of ATAG to make a long-term commitment to address their climate change impact with a series of climate change goals, reducing our CO2 emissions by 50% by 2050 when compared with 2005 levels, and putting in place a famous four-pillar strategic plan to take us towards those goals. And I think there's a recognition across the sector that sustainable aviation fuel has an absolutely fundamental role to play in us reaching those goals. We're also 10 years on from the first ever flight using some blend of sustainable aviation fuel. So as I said, it's really a perfect moment in time for us to dive into this topic in some detail. Now, I recognize tomorrow you'll also hear from a panel looking at the environmental agenda and sustainability from a broader perspective. We really just wanted to focus in this time on the topic of SAF. And I'm really delighted to welcome Paoletta, who is the head of aviation solutions at Neste. Neste is a Finnish producing and refining company, really one of the market leaders in this space, leading the charge, bringing the whole industry forward on this really important topic. So it's terrific to have Paul with us. He's an industry leader. He's been in and around the aviation sector for a number of years before joining Neste just last year, specifically to lead their activities in this area. I think it's great to have him. Often we talk about sustainable aviation fuel internally within the airline and aviation industry community, and to have someone who's actually going to be producing the fuels for our sector to give us his perspective, really, I think is absolutely crucial. We're just going to take it back to basics to start off with, because for those not involved in this space on a day-to-day basis, there are a number of, I think, misapprehensions, misunderstandings about what SAF is and what it does. So Paul, just to kick off, can you tell us, how does sustainable aviation fuel work? Is this stuff actually safe? How does it reduce our CO2 impact?
Sure. Well, first of all, Michael, thank you for having me here. It's an honor and pleasure to be speaking to all of you. Sustainable aviation fuel, sometimes I'll refer to as SAF. There are currently 5 pathways, feedstocks, pathways that produce renewable jet fuel, SAF, renewable jet fuel. It's approved by the certification board, ASTM. It's completely compliant, and there are different processes, like Neste has one, which is called HEFA. The feedstock, which is the raw material, comes from different sources. We use animal waste and fatty acids, and they go into it, but at the end of the day, the chemical structure of the fuel is all more or less the same, and so it becomes, in a neat form, it becomes a 7566. Under ASTM standards, it's a 7566, it's a chemical. When it's blended into jet fuel, and depending on the pathway, it has a different blend ratio. And for HEFA, for example, for us, that means 50% blend ratio, maximum, under the ASTM certification. It then becomes a 1655. So it's a completely drop-in product. It can go into the hydrogen systems. It can go into any storage tank. There's no issues with the storage. So is it safe? Yes, it is. Does it have a long shelf life? Can it stay there for a long time? Yes, it can. And regarding as to how it, let's say, how it works and how does it lower CO2, This is based off of the greenhouse gas, the carbon intensity of a fuel is calculated from basically what we call from farm to flight. So during the whole path of the production. So that includes the feedstock itself. It includes the shipping, the manufacturing process, the shipping to the airplane, and then ultimately the burn. And currently, right now, depending on which pathway you choose, which feedstock, renewable fuel saves 80% of CO2 emissions.
So in basic terms, we're talking about fuel which looks, smells, performs like jet aviation fuel, and it reduces the environmental impact by anything up to 80%.
Correct.
Well, what's the current state of play with SAF? How much of it is out there, and how much do you think can be reduced?
Sure. I'll put it into a larger context. So currently, right now, in renewable fuels, so second generation renewable fuels, currently there's about 6 million tons being produced per year, per annum. In that 6 million tons, we're expecting that by 2023 to go up to 13 million. So we see, so there's good growth, good investment taking place, where we will see more than doubling of the production. Currently, renewable jet fuel represents less than 1% out of that 6 million. So it becomes a very, let's say, a difficult story, or let's say it seems more of a challenge to get to the challenges we need to do as an aviation industry. But the good news is that by 2023, with the recent announcements by Neste and some of our competitors, which we embrace, we do see that 15% of the total production will be then given to renewable jet fuel.
I mean, these are still small percentages you're talking about.
Correct.
What are the barriers? What's preventing the commercial deployment of SAF on a much wider basis here in Europe, but also in other parts of the world?
Yeah, so Michael, I would say there's two areas. One is government. So right now, why are the 6 million tons going to other industries being road transportation? That's the number one, is because of government incentives. So the aviation industry really needs to come together collectively and lobby the governments to ask for the same what's happening on the road as to what can happen in aviation. So that's number one. And then number two, then you need the commitment from basically who's buying the jet fuel are the airlines. So we need long-term commitment from the airlines. There's been some progress. There's been some leaders in the industry, but we need many more. And with that, then, that's where you get the scalability.
So just to push you again on some of the challenges, I mean, why is this, I mentioned the first flight back in 2008. Why is it taking so long to penetrate into the market? There must be some fundamentals reasons in there.
Sure. Yeah, I'm going to change that to say let's look at it a little bit more positively. The industry has done, since the first flight, 150,000 flights. So that's substantial, and they were all safe. So it's a new business, it's a new industry. We're working in a very complex and multi-stakeholder environment, and so I think 150,000 is something. However, we do need to do more, and by more, we need the airlines, the governments, and the manufacturers to think differently and work more together, more collaboratively.
So just thinking ahead then, working towards what may be solutions to this conundrum, what do you think needs to fundamentally change in the market for this to become more prevalent?
Yeah. In my time within Neste and within the industry, this is quite unique because the problem is not owned by one entity. It can't be owned and it can't be burdened by just the airlines. Airports, local governments, passengers need to recognize and also support. So, with the mega trends taking place and public perception, and especially the younger generation wanting to solve this issue and address this issue of climate change, we need everyone to step in, and it can't just be borne as a burden, a financial burden to the airlines.
So you're talking about greater collaboration now. For my organization, ATAG, collaboration is part of our day-to-day business. We bring together this whole sector of the aviation industry around our climate change plan. Do you, in your own way, support what we're trying to do? Do you see that a collaborative approach to creating a proper market for SAF is important, and is it feasible?
To the last part, is it feasible? Yes. Yes. And do I like what I see, and do we recognize what ATAG is doing? Of course. And we're big supporters of ATAG for all the initiatives they're taking. But again, it means that the airlines and the airports need to collaborate together. The airports, so within Neste, we take a little bit more of a holistic view. It's not just about airlines, even though the jet fuel is a major component. We're taking a look more at the industry as a whole holistically, so all of aviation. And so what can the airlines, the airports having their ground support equipment, that contributes also to the pollution. That's not owned by the airlines, that's not their responsibility. However, it's within the same community. So we look at it as how we can help the total community in decarbonizing and defossilizing.
So that's what you expect from the industry. There's one fundamental piece here, and you alluded to it, is support from governments. There's a real need for policy support from governments. Yeah. In trying to drive ahead with deployment of SAF, what is the role of government as far as you're concerned, and where can we as an industry perhaps push government more?
Sure. Renewable fuels is no different than any other technology. And in fact, at the airports, we compete against other new technology, renewable technologies. Whether it's wind, whether it's solar, whether it's electrification, governments have been there to support those industries quite heavily and in different ways. So whether it can happen through taxes and investment incentives, I'm not here to influence one or the other, but governments are there to help. With renewable fuels, let me step back for a second. With electrification of a bus, for example, ground support equipment in a bus, there's incentives for airports to electrify. However, there's not the incentive for the renewable fuels to go into the same ground support equipment, when sometimes it may make sense to, if a bus has only 5 years left of life on it, rather than electrify, maybe it makes more sense to use renewable fuels. So we need government policies to really be a little bit more agile and support the industry collectively to bring us together.
Just to touch on, I guess, the most sensitive environmental issue coming out of the adoption of SAF, and this is the position that's been put forward by civil society, by the NGOs. It's the question as to whether SAF is genuinely sustainable. Are we not replacing one form of crop with the crop needed to produce sustainable aviation fuels? As a producer, how are you working to ensure that that's not the case, that this fuel is genuinely sustainable?
Sure. We work with all our feedstock, our fuels are certified. We work with large certification boards like ISCC. We work with large auditing bodies like SGS to make sure that whatever we are using is certified all the way literally from farm up to the wing. We follow the entire process. This is very, very strategic and very important to Neste. So we have many other certification processes that we take place to make sure that our feedstock is not competing with food supplies, the feedstock for food. But again, most of our feedstock is coming from waste and residue.
It's a really important aspect, and I think it was somewhere where the industry got a bit of criticism in the early years of SAF, and so very important to hear that you're focusing on the genuine
Sure.
sustainability. These are issues that we could go into in a lot of detail and probably spend an entire day discussing, but I hope you've got a very good overview from these few moments as to where the key issues of sensitivity are and where we as an industry working with the producers, the producing community need to work together. Just to draw this to a conclusion, Paul, you've got a room of industry leaders out here. From your perspective, in your discussions, where do you think the airline CEOs are on this issue? And if you had to make a call to action to them today, what would that be?
Sure. The call to action, so I've seen dozens of airlines in the past 18 months. Where I see the CEOs in the C-level, they get it. We know that we have to change. The question I would say, or the challenge I would say, is that within your organizations, often, not, and again, it's not specifically a one, you see that there's a gap between operations and sustainability teams. The KPIs that drive them are different. And so in order to make renewable fuels happen today, that happens within often within the operations team. So we need them to collaborate a little bit more together. We need the KPIs. We need to look a little bit more holistically. Neste, for example, we're not looking just at the fuel tank, as I mentioned before. We're looking at ground support equipment. We're looking at how to defossilize your de-icing, your cleaning solvents, paints, and including plastics. We do many applications with large partners in defossilizing their plastics, which are also in cabins and in terminals. So we have to think a little bit more holistically. So the action to the C-level is I think, more larger than just a fuel tank, and make sure your teams are speaking together and aligned, so that way it facilitates the supply.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention. Please join me in thanking Paul for his clear insight and clear message.
Thanks, man. Thanks.